that over time and with the willingness of the county and the county's stakeholders, the Continuum of Care Board, and all of those stakeholders, I think that you could look at realigning funds over time. And when I say over time, I don't mean like wait. I mean just the nature of that funding source is annual. Yeah, and so there are some shifts you could make. Also, rapid rehousing in this particular area, that is a place where, to Supervisor Bass's point, I think it is possible that that will be a good use of private money as well. It's a really high-performing program type, which is a nice thing to go to private funders with, and it's also, it may end up being a real gap that you have.
Great. I have quite a stack going here. Supervisor Sundberg, Councilmember Cherubellini, Supervisor Fennell, Councilmember Arroyo, and then I have a question of my own. Oh, and you can ask. Okay. Thank you, Vice Chair.
Thank you. So my question revolves around the interim housing. So you said that there's the MAC as the local example. I would assume that fills up very quickly. So what are the other examples of appropriate interim housing ideas?
So I think Barbara's probably the best person to answer this.
So the MAC we look at for 30 to 60 days of interim housing. The Veterans has some programs as well. And then outside of that, we're talking about more of the shelter, the mission model where they're going for the night and then decide to come back, and Arcata partnership. But the interim housing models would really be the MAC, and then the Veterans also has a short-term transitional interim housing program.
So I guess part of the question then would be is that we've been asked even today, I've been asked to declare a shelter crisis, so it makes it easier to put people in county buildings or areas. I'm not seeing that anywhere in this presentation, so can you tell me how that fits into this?
Thank you. I understand what you're asking, I think. So, so I understand that there's been some attention to the declaration of a shelter crisis and sort of figuring out what those next steps might be. Anything that isn't supporting pathways to housing is not going to reduce the size of your homeless population. So I don't know if this is going to answer your question exactly, and please let me know if it doesn't. I want to answer your question. Whenever shelter is, especially emergency shelter, is a very delicate issue in my mind, because on the one hand, people die outside, and that happens all the time. Homeless people die outside, and they die for lots of reasons. But if they weren't outside, in many cases, they wouldn't have died, right? So, it is providing adequate emergency shelter is a really important issue, and I don't mean to downgrade or demean that in any way. At the same time, if your objective as a community is to reduce homelessness, then spending a lot of time, and especially time and resources, on trying to respond to provide more shelter in the hopes that your unsheltered population is going to come inside is likely to be a distraction from the actual solutions, which are to provide housing. So in general, what we see is that people, communities many times will be, there's such an urgency, and everybody feels it regardless of what the motivation is. There's a real urgency to deal with the issue. And so I would say responding at a crisis, you know, that this is a crisis at a crisis level, and opening shelters is where we really started in the 80s. And what we've learned from the data that we've collected over the last 10 or 15 years and really looked at to figure out, well, what actually works to reduce homelessness and get people housed to solve the actual problem is to provide pathways to housing for people. And so having a housing first approach really is about focusing on getting people into housing and building those pathways to get people into housing and those interventions, so that everybody can have a safe place to be and the community isn't experiencing the kind of visible, miserable, unsheltered homeless population that you seem to have.
Okay. Next, we have Councilmember Cherubini.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And welcome, Megan. Nice to see you again, and thank you for this comprehensive report. My question was along the same lines as Supervisor Sundberg. And in your first white paper, policy paper, you talked about as you were talking right now, about managing the problem as opposed to solving the problem. And at that point, you recommended that, we focus more on solving the problem than putting resources into managing the problem. And in your most recent report, I noticed that you identified some new federal guidelines on homeless encampments as of August 2015 that basically reinforces those ideas of yours, but specifically addresses encampments. And it just says here, authorizing encampments as an official part of the system for responding to homelessness creates costs to ensure the safety and security and well-being of the people living within the encampments, which can prevent funding from being directed to supporting and creating permanent housing and services for all people who are unsheltered. So is that still your recommendation? And do you still consider, in terms of talking about interim housing, you're not talking about temporary tent cities or encampments. Can you clarify that?
Yes, we do not recommend embracing a tent city or anything similar. Overwhelmingly, what we see is that when that strategy is embraced, a lot of resources, and it's both human resources and dollars, end up, whether they start with that plan or not, end up going toward managing that. Really what happens is that the address or location of the place about which you get complaints changes, but it does nothing to actually reduce homelessness. So it tends to just delay the progress on reducing homelessness that many communities are seeing.
I also had another question, if I
Let's
could.
continue.
I found it interesting in your housing market analysis. You talk about the vacancy rate here in both the county and the city is 3.7%. Is that generally an average of areas like ours and population-wise?
Well, if someone had asked me that 5 or 10 years ago, I would have said, wow, that's really low. But we overall, as a nation, are experiencing smaller and smaller vacancy rates. The entire West Coast is smaller, tighter markets than the rest of the country. And so the folks who inevitably say, where's the housing? It's not that they don't have a point. The vacancy rate is pretty low. That said, there are communities who are successfully housing people with rapid rehousing and permanent supportive housing whose vacancy rates are functionally zero at this point in time. And I would point to the Silicon Valley in particular. So there is housing, and it's not like you have hundreds and hundreds of units just waiting for people right now, but you actually do have several hundred units you probably, with hard work, you probably could identify and successfully house people.
Yeah, that was where you say here that it might be tight, but there is sufficient inventory to house a large share of the existing homeless population. So would you say then really focusing on working with those landlords and that strategy that you laid out there with incentive programs is probably ought to go maybe near the top of our list?
Yes, yes, we recommend you put that right near the top of the list, get that Housing First summit and training rolling so everybody who's going to do that work understands the expectations. I will also say having the actual staff who are doing the landlord recruitment and retention work be very skilled and very good at their jobs is really important. That is a really important piece. That's as you might imagine, you need an ability to communicate with lots of different kinds of people who have different kinds of interests. So I would say really working on that piece and getting it staffed just right is absolutely critical.
Thank you.
So on the list now, I have Supervisor Fennell, Councilmember Arroyo, myself, and Councilmember Atkins. Yours is okay. What I'm going to suggest is, before we go through that after those on the list, that perhaps we go to the public at that point to allow them an opportunity. And I also just want to suggest that I'm concerned that with this size of a room, if we try to take a break at any point, it's going to take us 20 minutes to pull things back together. So I just suggest if anyone needs to get up for a moment to, take that opportunity as they see fit. So, okay. So with that, Supervisor Fennell.
Well, so what I'm hearing with, as a follow-up, I have a couple of points. Okay, so what I'm hearing as a follow-up to what Supervisor Sundberg said with regard to a shelter crisis is that that's an older vision, and the newer vision really to replace that is Housing First, and that's what you're recommending.
Yes, we would recommend that you wholly embrace a Housing First strategy and really focus on those pathways to permanent housing. Yes.
So you also mentioned, and we have to get used to these new terminologies, what used to be known as Section 8 housing, now known as housing choice vouchers. So there's an allotment for 1,200, but typically we stop around 950 just because the market is saturated at that point. So if 1,200 is the allotment, and we stop at 950, if we were able to find the extra, that would be 250, which is coming close to your 259 target, and it's funded. So is that the direction we should be looking?
I think that is definitely a direction to be looking, and I think that looking at that hand in hand with that landlord outreach and engagement piece in a creative way to address concerns about oversaturation would be a great strategy to capitalize on that.
Basically, I'm thinking because the funding is there. I mean, for so much of this, it's a huge prospect to identify funding. So, thank you.
Thank you.
Great.
Oh, and one other point I wanted to make, just to add a little brighter note. Part of the presentation was also that there is, in fact, eminent housing for 49 veterans on the horizon as a DANCO project, and I think that's very important for people to be aware of.
And congratulations on that. It's not an easy time to be building new affordable housing, and it's critical. Yeah.
Councilmember Arroyo.
Thank you. I have 3 questions. So on the topic of interim housing, since this has been much in the public spotlight. So, you mentioned that our community is sort of an order of magnitude greater as far as our homeless population, proportionate to our population. And it looks like a lot of the alternatives that are in existence currently for interim housing, no matter what they look like, are operated privately. That is to say, not with city or county funds as the bulk of their operation budget. So is there any reason to prevent other organizations from pursuing interim housing options, perhaps not a tent city, but other interim housing solutions, if it's not something that local government is focusing on? If we remain focused on housing first, but we let other organizations be our partners or fundraising, and implementation sort of leaders in that way.
We would really recommend that anybody who's interested in funding and working on homelessness really focus on the housing, really focus on getting people into permanent housing. One thing I haven't mentioned yet, but I think is particularly important in this community, from what I've seen myself, is that I think that you have a lot of people who have disabilities, particularly chronic substance abuse and mental illness, and that's certainly in your numbers as well. And many people who have those types of disabilities, not everybody, but many people who have those types of disabilities find it very difficult to be in a communal environment. So following rules, being close to noise and close to other people often doesn't work out. And so a lot of times when people are responding to an unsheltered crisis, they think that an emergency shelter or interim housing, will quick make something available for people so they're safe and not visible, and, lots of good reasons. But the reality is many of the people who are the most ill and frankly often have the most troubling behaviors are not going to come into a shelter. And so it's really, but you can often house people in their own apartments. And so we would really encourage that you focus instead on housing those folks.
Okay. And my second question is about the diversion programs, pet programs, landlord financial incentives that you mentioned. Those are all really new tools to me that I'm excited about. So thank you for making those part of your analysis. I noticed that the financial piece of that was not part of the housing market analysis, nor the funding source inventory that I saw. Perhaps a couple of those funds could be used for those purposes, but I didn't see it specifically called out. So I was wondering if you have sources of funding for that you know of, and the numbers from other communities sort of proportionate to the population. Like how much do we need to set aside for the landlord incentive piece, the pet care, et cetera?
Okay, so those are good questions, and I can't give you an exact figure at the moment, but that's certainly something that could you jot that down for me? That's certainly a question that I can respond to. I don't want to confuse your numbers with another places and give you the wrong answer. But that's something that we can sort of give some guidance, and obviously it'll be a range kind of depending on how things go here and how you roll it out and how successful your diversion is and things like that, but we can certainly give you some ideas. But many of the sources that we were talking about actually can be used for a lot of those pieces, which is the funding, the array of funding that is in that table in the back is, as you well know, it's all very complicated in terms of what eligible uses are for each source, but they can be layered together.
Okay, thank you. And last but not least, I wanted to talk about messaging and how to communicate effectively about this, because it is such a new approach, and people, I think, aren't familiar with these concepts. I'm sure it's no surprise to you that we hear all the time that people say, I don't want my tax dollars going to drug users, or whatever version of that statement. And it's sort of an emotional response that I don't think has a lot to do with facts. So I'm not sure that responding with these facts is going to change hearts or minds. So I'm wondering if you have sort of an elevator pitch or a way of talking about this that is the quick, succinct, effective version. And it's okay if you don't have it right now, but.
No, that's all right. This one I think I have. So I would say two things. One is that big, bold, this is our vision. We are going to significantly reduce homelessness in Eureka and Humboldt County, or end it, or whichever language and goal you want to put out there. and be bold and clear about that being the goal, that you're going to get everybody into housing, back integrated in the community, right? Sort of suggest that we're no longer going to have groups of people who were uncomfortable seeing homeless together, right? That's one piece of that, and that overall it is just about that bigger vision. In terms of the specific, and that was probably a little polite, but in terms of the specific sort of response of, I don't want my tax dollars going to, whoever, I think the best approach is a really pragmatic approach. The reality is you can either house people and no longer have the kind of visible homelessness that you have in Eureka and Humboldt County right now, or you can continue to have what you've got. But either way, you're spending a lot of money. You're spending a lot of money on emergency services that you won't be spending in the future if you house people. It isn't really a situation where now you're spending nothing and now we're going to spend something on people. It's actually, most cost studies have shown that you either spend the same or less by housing people.
And is that something that you have seen other communities prioritize as part of, shifting course in this direction?
You mean that messaging?
Yeah, the messaging piece and the sort of community outreach about, this is our strategy.
Yes, I've actually seen communities, especially big communities, hire PR firms and do, a lot of messaging around what it is that they're trying to accomplish. So there's certainly like materials and collateral and all that stuff that other folks have created that, we'd be happy to send your way if you wanted to take a look just at sort of how they were putting those things together. But in the end, I think what it always seems to come down to is, we're either as a community going to have this vision and hold to it, that we're going to house people and we're all going to row in the same direction. It's not perfect, but that's what we're doing. Or you're just going to stay where you are, and because people are just disagreeing.
Okay. I had one question. I understand Supervisor Bass has a quick comment to that point.
Just to add to Natalie or Councilmember Arroyo's question, I think the County of Santa Cruz have it down very well. Their whole community, whether they've got a leadership group, the board of supervisors. I know Charlotte McDonald went down there. I mean, they are living the vision. They are telling people. They've offered to have us come down, and they're willing to mentor. But I think there's some communities that are already doing a very good job of it, and they're the best I've seen so far.
So. My question was regarding the 3060 campaign, which sounds great. Sounds like a very aggressive approach, a very aggressive goal. And I appreciate the general discussion here, that recognizing that if someone's in a campground, they're still homeless. If someone's in an emergency shelter, they're still homeless. And that the goal is not to get them into these facilities, but to get them out of those facilities and into housing. In Arcata, we had a recent project that was mentioned, the Arcata Bay Crossing, that involved the MHSA funding for 15 of the units for permanent supportive housing, which when we talk about for the most chronic homeless, for 30, the most chronic homeless, I assume that that's probably the population that we're talking about here. That project took a long, long time to bring to fruition. So can you give me a little greater sense? Presumably, we're not talking about, building new projects in 30 days. That's probably not going to happen in 60 days. But so can you give a better sense of exactly what kinds of pieces we'd be looking for that?
Yes. In order to be successful, you'd need to line up your work and your landlords, and you would need to use market rentals. And house people in an integrated way in the community. So permanent supportive housing has been shown to be equally effective with the built unit type properties that you're talking about, as well as market units. In general, a shortage of affordable housing is a problem not just for low income people who can't afford a place to live, but also because, of course, it pushes on homelessness too. There aren't the supply, and as we've seen over the years, in the recession, getting people into market rentals was no problem because landlords really liked us. We had full subsidies, And those days right now are gone, and now we're really looking at having to have these kinds of incentive programs and so on. Anyway, I'm saying this basically to say having that diversity in your portfolio in the long run, in the big picture, having built unit properties, affordable properties, having these rental subsidies that you can give to private market landlords. You need to have a mix of all of those to be successful in the long run, and this 30/60 campaign is really focused on those market rentals.
So it wouldn't be a one-size-fits-all. We'd be looking at perhaps 5 folks housed this way, 6 or 7 housed in that way, and just a variety to be able to meet that target.
You'd want to look at every available possibility, and folks have mentioned the HCV program and the possibilities there. You could look just in terms of your community landlords, your market rentals. You can look at your conventional public housing. You can look at any and all inventory that you have, and kind of line that up to move folks in. Yeah.
Great. Thank you. I see one last question from Councilmember Arroyo, and then I would like to go to the public after that.
Thank you. I noticed the Housing Summit was a big piece of this, and you've mentioned it again a couple of times, and I see the planning for it in the implementation work plan, but I don't see the Housing Summit, and I'm just wondering if you have an idea of how far out we should project to plan that adequately.
That's a good question. I actually would ask, do you want to speak to that? I'll give Barbara a second to think about that while I say. So I think it's important that we've had some conversation about if these two bodies were to decide to move forward with this plan, sort of how you would roll out our recommendation. So I can feel that I can speak to the what, but I'm hesitant to speak to the how too much, so I don't know if you could.
Yeah, I think that was something that we wanted to put together. We've already had some community interest in helping us put that together, but it was certainly one of those topics that would come into the leadership team and talk about who do we want to be the leaders, what would it look like. So, I'm assuming that's going to be kind of 3 to 6 months out, but we want to kind of get through this plan and then look at gathering the community support and the planning, and then with all of you kind of decide a good time to do that. But pretty exciting for all of us to have that, and great for me to get phone calls and people saying, yeah, I really want to help do that. So.
Okay, so at this point, I'm going to open this up to members of the public that would like to address us on this item. And first off, could I just see a show of hands of about how many people wish to comment on this? Okay, so I'm going to allow for 3 minutes per person. And just for folks that have not been to our board meetings before, I would ask for people to not applaud or make noises relative to someone's comments as we work our way through this. Just allow each speaker to say their piece, and just helps things move a little more smoothly, and can make it less intimidating to some people who perhaps have a more difficult time speaking here in public. So with that, I'll invite invite Betty to make our first comment here.
I gotta go because I gotta feed the people. First, I want to respect all your elect officers here, city manager, Barbara, everybody. You guys done a good job. And Megan, nice to hear from you, and Rob, everybody. Anyway, I just want to let you know, homeless issue never go away. Always could be here. And matter how you're going to help them and feed them, personal. Feeding them is not important. Personal connection with them very important. You talk about housing. Last week, I had a landlord just send me a key. Betty, you find a family. You need it. You don't need an employee to find a landlord. The landlord will find you if you're working well and knowing the people can take care of the house. You cannot send a homeless family in a house without the case management. Without helping got the job, I moved 26 family in a house with the children. 25 people, family, 7 months later, pay me back my deposit and my first month they pay, and also they get a job. They say, Betty, I get yell and screaming because I never work. I sweat, I scare, I work very hard, but at the end of the day, I got a paycheck. I can pay my own rent. So that's what we want to help the people. And I just wanted to tell you guys, I don't talk your language, sorry. I just tell all your people, you all work very hard. Someday we can work together. And in the light now, I got the